Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your daily deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Chris, and joining me as always is Laura.
Today we are walking into one of the strangest, most fascinating crossover stories the AI world has produced in years, and I genuinely cannot wait to dig into it with you.
I have been thinking about this story all weekend, Laura, because the Vatican and Silicon Valley are not phrases that usually share a sentence. And yet here we are this morning.
Exactly, and the headline is simple but enormous. Pope Leo the 14th is publishing his very first encyclical today, Monday, May 25th, and it is entirely about artificial intelligence.
When you say his first encyclical, can you remind our listeners what that actually means in terms of moral weight? Because I think a lot of people may not fully realize.
An encyclical is the highest form of papal teaching document sent to every bishop on earth, and it sets the Church's formal moral position for an entire generation of Catholics.
So this is not a press release. This is not a speech at a conference. This is the closest thing the Catholic Church has to a foundational moral statement on AI.
That is exactly right. And the document is titled Magnifica Humanitas, which translates roughly as Magnificent Humanity, with the subtitle on the protection of human dignity in the age of AI.
I love that subtitle because it tips the Pope's hand right from the very first line. And he is clearly framing this as a story about us rather than about machines.
He has said as much in his pre-launch remarks, telling the College of Cardinals that the central challenge facing society today is not technological, but anthropological, which is a striking line.
Anthropological. So he is saying the real question is not what AI can do, but what AI is doing to the very idea of what it means to be a human person.
That framing alone is going to shape the conversation for years because it forces every developer, every founder, and every regulator to answer the question of what humans are actually for.
Let's get into the date, because the timing here is not accidental at all. And I think it tells you a great deal about how seriously the Vatican is taking this moment.
He signed the document on May 15th, exactly 135 years to the day after Pope Leo the 13th signed Rerum Novarum back in 1891.
For people who have not studied Catholic social teaching, can you quickly explain what Rerum Novarum was and why it still matters so deeply in 2026 and beyond?
Rerum Novarum essentially created modern Catholic social teaching on labor and capital, responding directly to the brutal working conditions of the Industrial Revolution in the late 1800s.
So Leo the 13th looks at factories, child labor, and the collapse of guild work, and writes the moral playbook that shapes labor rights debates for an entire century after that.
Now his namesake, Leo the 14th, looks at neural networks, autonomous agents, and chatbot companions, and he is writing what he clearly hopes will be the moral playbook for the AI century.
The symbolism of choosing that exact anniversary is so deliberate that I want to ask you directly. Is this the Pope explicitly saying this is our generation's industrial revolution moment?
It is absolutely that, and Vatican watchers have been clear that this was a deliberately chosen signal that the Church believes AI is the defining labor and dignity question of our time.
Okay, let's talk about the launch event itself, because the guest list is where the story gets genuinely strange and very interesting for our audience of technology professionals.
The ceremony happens at 11:30 this morning at the Vatican Synod Hall, and Pope Leo himself is attending in person, which is genuinely unusual for an encyclical rollout event.
Usually a pope writes the document, and the Curia presents it on his behalf. So the pope showing up personally tells you this matters more than almost anything else on his agenda.
And here's the part that has everyone in the AI ecosystem talking. Christopher Olah, the co-founder of Anthropic, is one of the lay speakers presenting at this papal launch ceremony.
Let me make sure I have this right, because that is genuinely the headline of the headline. A San Francisco AI startup founder is going to speak at a papal encyclical launch.
That is correct, and as far as I can tell, no AI company founder has ever participated in a papal encyclical rollout before in history, which makes this a genuine first.
Why Olah specifically, though? Because Anthropic has plenty of public faces, and the Pope could have invited Dario Amodei or any number of other prominent AI safety voices in the field.
Olah leads Anthropic's interpretability research, which is the work of literally trying to look inside neural networks and understand what individual neurons and circuits are doing during model inference.
I think I see where this is going. The Pope is essentially saying you cannot defend human dignity if you do not actually know what the machines are doing inside themselves.
Exactly that. Interpretability is, in a strange and beautiful way, a deeply theological project, because it is the attempt to make the invisible legible and to bring the hidden into the light.
That is a stunning framing, Laura. and it explains why Anthropic specifically and Olah specifically were the right partners for a document about the moral visibility of these powerful systems.
There are also two cardinals, two theologians, and the Vatican Secretary of State delivering the closing remarks. So this is clearly not a quiet document tucked away on a shelf somewhere.
It is also worth noting that the Vatican has been quietly engaged on AI ethics for years, with the Rome Call for AI Ethics back in 2020 pulling in IBM, Microsoft, and several major institutions.
Exactly. So this is not the Vatican suddenly waking up to the issue. This is the culmination of about 6 years of careful theological and diplomatic groundwork on the moral implications of these technologies.
Can we get into the substance of what we expect the encyclical to actually say? Because so far we have talked about the staging, but the actual content is what truly matters.
From pre-launch interviews and the Pope's own previous remarks, we know there are several major themes, and the first one is the dignity of labor in an age of accelerating automation.
That is the direct line back to Rerum Novarum, and I imagine the Pope is going to argue that work is not just an economic activity, but a fundamental and irreducible human good.
That is the expected framing, and the encyclical will likely push back hard on any vision of AI that treats human labor as something to be optimized away or made completely obsolete.
Which is a direct challenge to the productivity narrative that dominates so much of the AI discourse coming out of Silicon Valley and venture capital social media right now today.
The second major theme we expect is a strong condemnation of AI in warfare, particularly autonomous weapon systems that can select and kill human targets without meaningful human review or oversight.
That is going to land in a very specific political moment, given how much military AI procurement we have seen from the Pentagon and from European defense ministries during this past year.
The third theme that has been previewed is the protection of children from AI companion products that pretend to be friends and quietly exploit the developmental need for genuine human connection.
That one cuts very deep for me, because I know parents who are wrestling right now with how to handle the AI girlfriend, AI tutor, and AI confidant products targeting young teenagers.
The Pope has used very strong language on this, talking about chatbots and other technologies that exploit our need for human relationships in ways that quietly damage real and meaningful human bonds.
And the fourth major theme is what he calls a politics of the common good. Essentially, the idea that markets and technology must be regulated to serve everyone, not just shareholders.
That is going to be read as a direct challenge to the laissez-faire instincts of a lot of AI leadership. And you can already imagine the reactions on certain venture capital podcasts.
So let me try to summarize the worldview being articulated here, because I think it is genuinely coherent and worth taking seriously even if you do not share the underlying Catholic faith.
Please do, because I think many of our listeners hear the word Pope and assume this is going to be reactionary. But the actual framing is philosophically rigorous and worth engaging with directly.
The Pope is saying the worth of a human person is intrinsic. It is not produced by labor. It is not produced by output. And AI must never be allowed to redefine that.
From that single premise flows everything else. The worker has dignity beyond economic value, the child has dignity beyond engagement metrics, and the soldier has dignity that autonomous targeting violates fundamentally.
It is a coherent moral system. And what makes it especially interesting is that it is offered as a counterweight to the three big regulatory blocks of the United States, China, and the European Union.
That is a really sharp point because the Vatican is essentially saying we are not a state, but we are a global moral voice. And the AI conversation needs more than 3 secular regulators.
How do we expect Silicon Valley to receive this? Because encyclicals carry no legal force in California, and most AI executives are not practicing Catholics in any meaningful sense of the word.
The smart ones will treat this very seriously because the document does not need legal force to shape investor sentiment, employee culture, and global public opinion about their products and platforms.
There is also a generation of AI engineers, many of them younger and more morally restless than the typical tech worker stereotype, who are actively looking for ethical vocabulary to make sense of what they are building.
That is a really important point because internal employee letters and walkouts at the big AI labs have already shown that the workforce inside these companies cares deeply about the moral framing of their work and outputs.
There's also the fact that roughly 1.3 billion Catholics around the world are going to hear this teaching reinforced from the pulpit in their parishes for years to come.
And those Catholics are users, employees, regulators, parents, teachers, and voters. So a moral framework reaching that many people quietly reshapes the demand side of every AI product on the market.
So what should our listeners be watching for in the actual text once it drops at 11:30 this morning, Rome time? which is the specific moment of release we are waiting for.
Watch for specific language on autonomous weapons, because that will tell you whether the Vatican is endorsing the international ban movement or simply expressing general concern about AI and war and conflict.
Watch also for the language on the dignity of work, because depending on how strong it is, it could change the way Catholic universities and Catholic hospitals procure AI tools going forward.
My prediction is that the document will be philosophically aggressive but commercially diplomatic, naming categories of harm rather than individual companies, which is generally how papal encyclicals tend to operate in practice and which gives the moral framework durability across changing market leaders.
Before we wrap, Laura, why does this matter to listeners who are not religious and who do not have any particular interest in Vatican politics or Catholic social teaching as a tradition?
It matters because moral language about AI has been almost completely absent from the policy debate. And the Vatican is one of the only global institutions willing to use that language openly and at scale, reaching billions of people simultaneously.
Governments talk about competitiveness, companies talk about innovation, and academics talk about risk. But very few people in the actual AI conversation talk about what is genuinely good and what is bad.
The Pope is going to put that vocabulary back on the table. And even if you completely disagree with his answers, the questions themselves are going to shape the next decade for everyone listening.
That feels like the right place to land, and I suspect we will be revisiting Magnifica Humanitas on this podcast many times over the coming months as the world responds to it in policy, in pulpits, and in the boardrooms of the biggest AI labs.
We will definitely come back to it, Chris, especially once we see the full text and how regulators, labor unions, bishops' conferences, and AI labs themselves begin responding to its specific arguments and prescriptions in the weeks ahead.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.